Hello and a warm welcome to the programme. Vladimir Putin may, just may, have angled to get Donald Trump in the White House. Now he gets to meet the successor. Will Joe Biden be tough on Russia's president? Or perhaps it's time for a reset? It's unlikely that Biden will say afterwards, he's a man I can do business with, as did Margaret Thatcher of Mikhail Gorbachev. But is there any way the two most powerful men in the world can generate a little bit of warmth into what some are calling a new Cold War? This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Well, they meet in Geneva on Wednesday, and the question is, what will the relationship between the United States and Russia look like? And how will that affect us all? Ahead of their meeting, the two presidents agree on at least one thing, that relations are pretty bad. Since taking office, Biden has described Russia's leader as a killer and imposed new sanctions on Russia. Those penalties were tied to the 2020 cyber attack on the United States. Other complaints include alleged election meddling, the annexation of Crimea, and the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. Putin says he wants to improve ties, but claims the United States wants to hold Russia back. The US goal of a predictable, stable relationship with Russia may be hard to achieve. Vladimir Putin has proved to be anything but predictable. Joining us out of Geneva for this round table, we say hello to Paul Vallet, International Relations Specialist with the Geneva Centre. Then we go to Tbilisi, and welcome back to Roundtable, Natia Seskuria from the security think tank RUSI. And then we head across to the United States. Klaus Larres has deigned to join us once more, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Great to have you with us. Paul, I'm coming to you because this meeting is going to be in Geneva. This will be the fifth sitting US president that Vladimir Putin has met, either in his role as prime minister or president. And it has been said that the relationship between the two is as bad now as it has been for a very, very long time. How would you describe it?
Indeed, it's a quite tricky relationship. Obviously, of course, Joe Biden's only been sitting U.S. president since last January, but of course they have dealt with each other before, and in particular during the 8 years that Joe Biden was vice president of the United States. And it's well to remember also in previous years when Joe Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And a recent article by Politico actually just reminded that Joe Biden's been actually a long time, if I may say, skeptic of Vladimir Putin and his rule in Russia. And as early as 2001, expressed a certain amount of mistrust in what Vladimir Putin's agenda was for Russia once he had become Russian president.
Natia, I don't know whether you want to come in at this point. I saw you sort of nodding in some kind of agreement. And my question to you, say whatever you want to say, but my question to you is, does it really make much difference what the character of the two men actually happens to be?
Yes, 10 years ago, we remembered when Biden met Putin as a vice president of the United States under the Obama administration, he famously stated that he thought that Russian president did not have a soul. Since January 2021, Biden's rhetoric towards the Kremlin has been very different from his predecessors, and he pledged a tougher stance towards Russia's continuous violation of rules-based order. The US has already issued sanctions on Russian officials over a long list of charges such as election interference, execution of cyber attacks, and violation of human rights. In return, we also saw that Russia has criticized the US's response and has accused Washington in an attempt to interfere in Russia's domestic affairs, which, according to the Kremlin, threatens international stability. So I think it's fair to say that the timing of the summit is very important, and at the moment, Russia-US relations are at its lowest point.
Okay, so thank you very much. Back with you in a moment, Natia. But Klaus, let me ask you, what would the United States want to see come out of this?
I think, as Biden has said several times, they expect some sort of normalization of relations, a more predictable relationship with Russia and Putin, a more reliable relationship. And at the moment, that is not the case. It's quite volatile with surprises around the corner every day. And that is what Biden wants to overcome. I don't think he has any illusions that a reset with Putin is possible. Going back to zero and starting anew and having a great relationship from now onwards. This is impossible, and Biden realizes it. But the volatility we see at the moment is not necessary either. And we have to remember, both states are still the world's greatest and largest nuclear power. So what we are dealing with when we have difficult Russian-American relations is rather dangerous, because nuclear war is still possible by default, by intention, whatever. Therefore, I believe embarking on a summit with Putin and talking to him, trying to sort out things to some extent, is a sensible way to go about it. There's been talk that Biden would reward Putin by embarking on that summit. I do not think that that is correct. Russia is a geopolitical factor which cannot be overlooked and ignored. You have to deal with it and try to get the best out of it, which is possible.
So let us hear now from Vladimir Putin on what he thinks America is up to, and then I'll come to you, Paul.
We have no disagreement with the United States. They only have one disagreement. They want to stifle our development. Everything is derivative from that. Economic restrictions and attempts to influence our internal political process at home by relying on powers they regard as their own.
So he says, Paul, America's sitting on us. It wants to stifle everything that we're trying to do. It's putting us down. Is that for domestic consumption alone?
I think, yes, there's a fair amount of domestic consumption in this expression, and it's probably, I think, one of the reasons why this summit is rather quite hyped, at least by the Russian party. That there's also being, of course, some expression in some of the Russian governing circles that they indeed wanted this summit opportunity to sit across the table from the U.S. leadership and be treated as equals. That is certainly of a great political importance internally at this moment in Russia. As you know, of course, there's a certain amount of opposition that's manifesting itself. It doesn't, of course, restrain the grip that the Putin regime has on power, but certainly it's far from the more harmonious image that was projected a few years back. So yes, being able to sit across from the U.S. president in the city of Geneva, a grand gathering, one-on-one, which is also, of course, a lot more interesting to the Russian party than, say, a much larger multilateral forum with a lot of other leaders sitting around.
Natia, you're nodding in agreement.
So I don't think that the summit will be a diplomatic win for Putin or a reward, but he will certainly try to portray the meeting as an achievement. Russian media has, in fact, already been praising the summit as a win for the Kremlin. In light of growing competition between the US and China, Moscow wants to be seen as an equal counterpart while realizing that chances of it realistically are low. Thus, the Putin-Biden summit will be portrayed as a meeting of equals and an acknowledgement from Washington that Russia is a great power. This is a particularly important point for Putin's regime because Russia is in the middle of another electoral cycle with an upcoming State Duma elections to take place in September. So with growing dissatisfaction at home, which is reflected in the approval rating of the pro-Putin United Russia Party, standing at the lowest in its history, as well as the economic hardships, sanctions, and inefficient handling of the Russian government of the COVID crisis, I think Putin heavily relies on propaganda and disinformation campaigns
Which makes me wonder what's going to happen if Joe Biden starts to lecture Vladimir Putin on human rights, on Alexei Navalny, on the situation in Belarus. That presumably cannot escape the attention of people in Russia, can it?
Absolutely. We saw recently that in his annual State of Nation address, Putin has warned its foreign adversaries that in case of any provocation and any attempt of testing the nation's strengths, Russia's response would be asymmetric, fast, and tough. He has repeatedly highlighted that Russia's good intentions, so-called good intentions, I would say, cannot be taken as an indifference or weakness, and those who will burn the bridges will receive a tough response from the Kremlin. But I don't think Biden is seeking or expecting from the summit that the relations between Russia and the US will be repaired. It is about clarifying expectations and responses to Russia's aggressive behavior. So I'm confident and sure that issues such as human rights violations, recent military mobilization and across the Ukrainian border, the extraordinary plane hijacking in Belarus that was carrying a Belarusian journalist will be also part of the discussion. Definitely the issue of Belarus and Ukraine will be among the key topic, and this is something that I'm sure President Putin will not be enjoying this conversation.
Okay. I'm just getting the sense that none of you think there's going to be like a eureka moment, a la Hofty House in Iceland in 1986, when Ronald Reagan offered to give up America's nuclear weapons as long as Mikhail Gorbachev did exactly the same. Is that your sense, Klaus, that it's optics on both sides here?
I mean, I'm not quite sure. Of course, both sides will proclaim they won. You know, they had a great summit. That is natural in international diplomacy, so both Putin and Biden will insist on that. But when we look at the geopolitical landscape and how it has changed over the last 6 months, then Putin will find himself even more on the defensive than before. It is clear there is a rallying of the transatlantic alliance under Biden, that the Europeans are closing ranks, they're driving a wedge and driving the Europeans apart, as Putin has tried to do during the Trump administration, will be much more difficult, much more impossible. So I think actually Putin will hope to obtain something good from the summit. And he also has to give something for that. He knows that he will have to promise something like a reduction of cyber attacks, or he says he will clamp down on private companies who do that sort of thing. With Ukraine or Belarus or even Crimea, it's very difficult to foresee that Putin, also for domestic reasons, for geopolitical ego reasons seen from his point of view, will be able to do something. But the Navalny case, it would be really easy for him to resolve that issue. He could simply issue a pardon for medical reasons, saying the poor man is such a bad state, I have to release him. You know, he would face, that wouldn't cost him anything. He would save face regarding Russian domestic opinion, and it would go a long way to improve relations with both the Europeans and the Americans. So I think Putin will see that summit as a unique chance to actually improve relations with the West. And he has been trying to do that for some time. He's trying to reach out to the Europeans to really get into on their better side again. And one of the reasons why he's doing that is, of course, the economy, difficult domestic relations in Russia, but also there is the China factor.
Well, this is something I was going to bring up just now. Sorry to cut you off, Klaus, but Paul, let me throw this one at you. It has been suggested in various sections of the press that Joe Biden may want to use Vladimir Putin, and from what Klaus was just saying, Vladimir Putin may want to give a bit of ground on this, to drive a wedge a little bit between Russia and China, to stop that alliance getting stronger. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly, if you look at it from a historical point of view, there have been some comparisons made to the Kissingerian attempt, but practiced the other way around in the early 1970s, reaching out to China in order to weaken the USSR. There's a slight difference of context here, too, because in the early 1970s, you really had a strong ideological and geopolitical rupture between the People's Republic of China and the USSR. And so this was a loophole that the US policy at the time could exploit. Nowadays, I think, and I would subscribe to very much to many of the things that Klaus has just enumerated, it might be a more difficult exercise, in part because the Putin regime, at least its grip on Russia, and the Chinese regime do have in common the fact that they want to preserve themselves, and in a way that brings them together in that part. Now, perhaps there is a wish on the part of Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership to get out a little bit from this relationship that they have developed with the Chinese regime. And yes, there are voices in Russia that are calling for better relations with the West, also in a cultural sense in that matter. But that remains very difficult to achieve, precisely because the nature of this regime, the Putin regime in Russia, is still far removed from the standards that have arisen in the West. And especially, of course, now that the European Union and that NATO have expanded to encompass a number of the countries that either used to be in the Soviet orbit in Central Eastern Europe, or in the case of the three Baltic states, or even component republics of the USSR, that certainly is something extremely tricky for Russia as it is to accept now, in part because these countries really do offer the example of what a fully transitioned regime can offer. And,
okay. I get that, Paul. And we've done a program very recently about the new NATO membership and the meeting of NATO in the light of what's going on in there. Do tune into that wherever you happen to be if you want to learn more about NATO. Roundtable. We're going to hear from Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor now, and then I'll come to you, Natia.
Joe Biden is not meeting with Vladimir Putin despite our country's differences. He's meeting with him because of our country's differences. There is simply a lot we have to work through. We believe that President Biden is the most effective direct communicator of American values and priorities, and we believe that hearing directly from President Putin is the most effective way to understand what Russia intends and plans. There is never any substitute for leader-to-leader engagement, particularly for complex relationships. But with Putin, this is exponentially the case. He has a highly personalized style of decision-making.
I know Vladimir Putin is already spinning the positive side of this for Russia. The United States doing exactly the same. What do you think the headlines will be at the end of this meeting?
I'm actually a little bit pessimistic about the outcome of the summit because I don't expect any tangible results to be achieved. Biden, in light of such aggressive rhetoric from both sides, which are followed from Russia's side, especially with actions, it is hardly imaginable that Biden would be able or would be willing to repair the U.S.-Russia relations and find common ground that would return the relations between the two countries back to normal. What we see since Biden came to power is a fundamental change in rhetoric, which when it comes to issues of fundamental disagreement, I think Biden's approach will be focused on reaching a desired outcome by applying pressure rather than reaching a negotiated settlement where both sides can cooperate. Over the years, we have seen that Russia under Putin is a deal taker, not a deal maker. With this regard, I would expect that maybe the new cycle of targeted sectoral sanctions will be introduced against Russia.
Okay. Klaus, is there more to be lost on both sides than there is to be gained from what seems to be largely a cosmetic exercise? Could things go terribly wrong for one or the other?
I really don't see it as largely a cosmetic exercise at all. It is, I think, a genuine attempt at engagement, and knowing that that engagement is not likely and that it is very difficult, but they want to inch forward a few inches. I do think that the Biden foreign policy is all guided by the China factor, not so much by transatlantic relations, not so much by Russia. These are ways on, or steps on the way to get at China and to contain and constrain China, and to make sure that China is not becoming number one, but that the United States is remaining number one. You know, that rallying of the transatlantic relations is really meant for its own sake and for democracy, but also for having a united front against China. And the same applies to that outreach to Putin. If Putin is brought away a little bit from China and back a little bit into a transatlantic or West or European concert of nations, that will help Biden to stand up to China and do something about the China factor in international affairs. When you listen what is happening in Washington, hardly anyone really talks about Europe and only a little bit about Russia. It's all dominated by China. It's technological competition, it's geopolitical competition, human rights problems, of course, and many other issues. And I think that is really what is driving Biden's outreach to Putin. And I think a little bit of a success will be achieved, perhaps in the Navalny case. And Putin, it would be in Putin's interest to get also away from China a little bit, because Russia is a junior partner to China. And does Russia want to be a junior partner to China and perhaps even have Siberia taken by China in a territorial way, which there is a genuine fear in Russia that that might happen in the near future. And I think Putin, of course, would say no to all that, and he will grasp the chance to arrive at a better relationship with the United States.
Okay, so you see something positive coming out of it. Natia, I will come to you because I could see you nodding in agreement, but I'm going to go to Paul first because you were doing exactly the same thing. And my question was, if it is simply optical, if it is cosmetic, what will the headlines be? But I don't think anybody agreed with me on that.
It's true that since the summit has been announced, I think there's been a fair amount of, fairly positive coverage. And in Switzerland, where I'm located, certainly this new summit in Geneva is presented as an important occasion. A lot of the emphasis has been put on the real potential that the discussions will allow greater progress, especially on the key issues of disarmament and counterproliferation. As you know, of course, the previous nuclear agreement with Iran were partly negotiated right here, and Switzerland played a fairly prominent role in hosting those talks at the time. And of course, they involved much more than just the United States and Russia. But if the engagement that's hoped from this summit can lead to some progress on the now ongoing talks in Vienna, that is certainly something that will be regarded as a good takeaway. And there's the issue, of course, of the New START agreements that need to be resolved as well.
Strategic arms reduction talks. So not just about the relationship between Russia and the United States, but incorporating many other countries as well. And Natia, how do you want to sort of round this up a little bit for us? Where do you think this is going to go down in terms of historic meetings between two massive countries?
So about the China point, I would agree with most of the points that have been mentioned. According to Putin, the relations between China and Russia are best in history at the moment. And in light of the increased pressure from the US, Moscow and Beijing are determined to even tighten the relations even further. This is definitely a challenge for Biden administration, despite the fact that Washington will be more focused on countering China than Russia. While in case of Russia, the US will seek for a more selective engagement. One of the key issues will be to reduce the scope of Russian-Chinese rapprochement. Washington, I think, sees China's geopolitical and economic ambition as well as dominance in technology field as a growing challenge. Thus, I think the US will be trying to pull Russia and China away from each other. Whether this is realistic or not, it is an arguable question. I don't think this will be easily achieved. Biden administration will be attempting to show that it can lead a more coherent policies than Trump did, such as strengthening also America's Indo-Pacific relationships. I think as of today, the US sees Russia as a security threat, while China is a more serious competitor, and creates challenges to Washington's leadership at the global stage. In terms of deliverables of this summit, unfortunately, just recently we saw that the political movement of jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny has been designated by the court as an extremist organization, while the anti-extremism law gives an opportunity to the regime to continue the crackdown on the opposition and its supporters. This, I think, once again sends a message that Russia is further shifting towards authoritarianism, and there is no appetite
Sorry
in
to
Moscow
say,
to receive any criticism.
You've made it plain, all three of you, and thank you very much for that, that China and Russia and human rights will be high up the agenda. You believe some progress can be made. I was going to bring in, what was it going to be? Oh, climate change, some element of that. They may be in the headlines, and also global cooperation on the pandemic. But we didn't really have time. So I want to say thank you very, very much indeed for you sparing us your time. We hope to have you on the show again in the future. Wherever you happen to be watching this, we thank you too for giving us your time. We know it's extremely valuable. We hope you found it worthwhile. From me, David Foster from the Roundtable team, goodbye for now. Hope to see you next time.